When rumors leaked in 1987 that the new Ford Mustang might become front-wheel drive, lose its V8, and be built on a shared platform with Japan's Mazda, the reaction was explosive, though not in the way Ford's management had expected. The backlash from enthusiasts was so strong that Ford had to quickly revise its plans for the Mustang and bring to market a completely unplanned model, which would become the Ford Probe. To understand how that happened, it makes sense to go step by step. The idea of a front-wheel drive Mustang emerged inside Ford in the mid-1980s, when more and more analysts and industry experts began to say that traditional rear-wheel drive sports cars were gradually becoming a thing of the past. The oil crisis of the 1970s significantly changed the market, and fuel efficiency became the top priority for buyers. Against this background, sales of sports cars, including the Mustang, dropped noticeably compared to what they had been in the 1960s and early 1970s. In this situation, Ford proposed a rather radical solution, a project under the internal codename SN16, which involved converting the Mustang to front-wheel drive and four-cylinder engines. Since Ford had owned a stake in Mazda since the 1970s, it was decided to use a Japanese platform as the basis for the new Mustang. The design of the future car was developed under the direction of Toshi Saito, and the final stage of the project was carried out in Japan at Mazda's facilities. The plan itself seemed logical. Gradually phase out the aging Fox body Mustang, keep it in production as the Mustang Classic, and replace it with a more modern car that would better meet the new market demands. But as soon as information about the front-wheel drive Mustang went beyond the company, the reaction was immediate and quite harsh. Mustang enthusiasts, one of the most loyal and sensitive audiences in the American car world, flooded Ford with thousands of letters. People openly described what was happening as a betrayal of the very idea of the Mustang. And according to some accounts, the tone even escalated to direct threats. The criticism went far beyond normal dissatisfaction. For many, the Mustang was not just a car, but a set of very clear principles. Rear-wheel drive, a V8, ease of modification, and a distinctly American engineering approach. The SN16 project offered none of that. Instead of the familiar formula, it proposed front-wheel drive, a Japanese platform, and a turbocharged four-cylinder engine. Faced with that reaction, Ford quickly realized it had made a serious mistake. Continuing in that direction was not just a risk, but a real threat to the Mustang brand and its audience. At the same time, the market itself was starting to shift. By the mid-1980s, fuel prices were falling, and efficiency no longer seemed as critical as it had a few years earlier. Mustang sales began to recover, driven in large part by the same enthusiasts who, after hearing about the possible replacement, started buying up the last rear-wheel drive cars, seeing them as the final, real Mustangs. At a certain point, the message for Ford became clear. The Mustang had to remain what people expected it to be. By the end of 1987, the SN16 project was already at an advanced stage, and simply canceling it was no longer an option. The solution was a compromise. The front-wheel drive coupe would be completed and brought to market, but as a separate model rather than a replacement for the Mustang. That is how the Ford Probe appeared, reviving a name that had already been used for a series of aerodynamic concept cars in the late 1970s and early 1980s. During those years, much of Ford's work on aerodynamics was led by Don Kopka, for whom it was a central priority. Under his direction, the average fuel consumption across Ford's lineup was noticeably reduced, and this became a key point in the company's advertising. Back in 1979, Kopka had already started work on a series of experimental cars, where aerodynamics was the main focus. The first of these was the Ford Probe 1 concept, introduced that same year. As promised, its aerodynamic performance was impressive, with a drag coefficient of just 0.23. It was not just a show car either. It was fully functional, powered by a 2.3-liter turbocharged engine, and claimed fuel economy was around 39 miles per gallon, or about 6 liters per 100 kilometers, which was an exceptional figure by the standards of the time. Probe 2 and Probe 3 followed, with engineers continuing to experiment, including work on safety and everyday usability. The third concept once again pushed aerodynamics further, reaching a drag coefficient of 0.22. Its design would later influence the Ford Sierra, which became a very successful model in Europe. After that came the more futuristic Probe 4 and Probe 5, introduced in 1982 and 1985, each pushing aerodynamic performance even further. Debuting in 1988 and going on sale in 1989, the Ford Probe only formally inherited its name from the mid-80s concept cars of the same name. Despite the visual similarity, the production model was developed as part of a separate project, the front-wheel drive successor to the Mustang, and its connection to the earlier concepts was more about the idea than any direct technical continuity. The Probe was built on the Mazda GD platform, which also underpinned the Mazda 626 and the MX-6 Coupe, and as mentioned earlier, the final stage of development took place in Japan at Mazda's facilities. At launch, the Probe was offered with two engines. The base 2.2-liter naturally aspirated engine produced around 110 horsepower and delivered decent performance by late 80s standards, with relatively moderate fuel consumption. The more interesting option was the turbocharged version of the same engine, producing about 145 horsepower and accelerating to 60 miles per hour in roughly 7 seconds. More importantly, there was another development. Starting in 1990, the Probe received a 3-liter V6 from Ford, the same Vulcan engine used in the Taurus and other mass-market models. It produced roughly 140 to 145 horsepower, but delivered its power in a much smoother and more relaxed manner, while also adding noticeable weight. This leads to an interesting point. On the Mazda platform, this was the only 6-cylinder engine available, which made the Probe unique in that respect. At the same time, the Mustang itself had already dropped the V6, leaving only the base 4-cylinder versions and the V8 in its lineup. As a result, a rather unusual situation emerged, where a front-wheel drive Probe with a V6 could be seen as a more balanced and versatile car than the traditional Mustang. In the 1993 model year, Ford and Mazda carried out a major update of the Probe and its sibling, the MX-6. At the same time, the car remained essentially the same at its core, still based on the Mazda platform, simply refined and reworked for the new generation. The base version came with a 2-liter engine, producing around 115 to 120 horsepower, while the GT received a 2.5-liter V6 with roughly 160 horsepower. There was no real revolution here, just an evolution, an attempt to maintain a balance between performance, efficiency, and increasingly strict emissions requirements. By the mid-90s, the market situation had changed. Fuel prices had stabilized, and the efficiency that had once justified this entire approach no longer played a decisive role. Buyers were once again turning toward more powerful cars, and what they considered real automobiles. At that same moment, Ford introduced a new generation of the Mustang. In 1994, the Mustang stayed true to its core principles, rear-wheel drive, a V8, and the familiar character of a pony car. Against that background, the Probe began to be seen in a very different light. In its early years, the model showed solid results. In 1989, more than 160,000 cars were sold, and in the early 90s, the Probe consistently held at around 100,000 units per year. By 1994, however, a clear decline began. Sales dropped to roughly 80,000 units, and by 1997, they fell to fewer than 20,000. The Mustang, which the Probe never replaced, continued to outsell it by a wide margin throughout this period. In 1997, Ford sold around 108,000 Mustangs compared to fewer than 20,000 Probes. The main problem with the Ford Probe was not the car itself, but how it was perceived. Despite attempts to position it as a separate model, the Probe was constantly compared to the Mustang, and for part of the audience, it did not feel like an independent car, but rather like that unfinished Mustang that never fully became what it was supposed to be. Competition in this segment was also strong. The Honda Prelude offered a higher quality interior and sharp handling. The Toyota Celica stood out for its reliability and balanced performance. Even the Mazda MX-6, built on the same platform, was often seen as a more complete and better executed car. With the arrival of the new Mustang, a significant share of buyers simply chose it instead of the Probe. At the same time, calling the Probe a failure would not be accurate. Around 750,000 units were sold, which is not a small number for a model that ended up on the production line almost by accident. And it is enough to imagine what could have happened if Ford had taken the SN16 project all the way and actually replaced the Mustang with a front-wheel drive model. The Probe became a reflection of everything buyers did not want to see in a Mustang. In a way, it played the role of a buffer. It took on the very idea the market rejected, and in doing so, helped preserve the Mustang itself. The intense backlash from Mustang enthusiasts also helped preserve an entire segment of cars, which would go on to see a strong revival in the 2000s. The 2005 redesign of the Mustang, along with the V8, triggered a wave of market enthusiasm that brought the pony car category back to life. The Probe itself was less fortunate. It was a well-designed and capable car, but the role it was given from the start effectively limited its chances for a different outcome. If Ford had developed it from the beginning as a separate model, rather than as a potential replacement for the Mustang, its story might have turned out very differently.